Good morning. Today's daf is Shevuos daf Mem. We begin today's daf by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilson family, for sponsoring all the shurim of the year. That is close for Shevuos for Am Yisrael. We also thank Dr. Steve and Dr. Terry Zinn for sponsoring all the shurim of the month in loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zinn Dvora Bas Rabbi Yisrael Yal, on her 5th yard side, and Shamash Heaven Aliyah, and the family Heaven Chama. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ilan and Elisa Roth, for sponsoring Daf Yomi today in memory of Bela Rivka Bas Meir. And we have a late breaking sponsorship here. We thank Michael for sponsoring Daf Yomi this morning. Is a zechus for Refuah Shlema for Yehuda Mordechai ben Charna Rivka. You should be zocheh to have a Refuah Shlema. Today's daf is daf Mem, but let that not fool you. We are starting on daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, about a third of the way down the Amud. I believe that the Rav left off by the two das Uchishemashbiyan also. Yes, the Gemara said Uchishemashbiyan also. When they make him take the Shevuah, Omer Malo, they say to him, Lavi Yodea Shelo Al Daitchi. You should just know that it really doesn't make a difference what you mean when you make this Shevuah. That's not the relevant point over here. The point is what we have in mind. In other words, we the Beis Din are going to tell you what we want you to swear about, and when you take this Shevuah, that is what your Shevuah is referring to. So Gemara asks, why do you have to tell this guy this? Why do you have to have this thing where the Beis Din has one thing in mind, and you're telling him you're swearing upon our mind? Gemara says, Mishom Kani de Rava, because of the story that happened with the stick of Rava. This is a story that came up previously in the Gemara, which was where this individual was brought to Beis Din because he denied a loan, and he had claimed that he had returned the money to its proper owner. He came to Beis Din, the owner was there, and he was adamant he had not gotten the loan back. And what happened? Beis Din told him, go ahead, take a Shevuah that you paid him back. He handed the Baal Chov, he handed him his walking stick, and while the Baal Chov was holding onto his walking stick, he took a Shevuah that he had paid him back, and the Baal Chov was so upset. He knew with clarity, 100% clarity, that this guy had not paid him back. He could not believe the guy had such an audacity to go ahead and take a false Shevuah in Beis Din that he paid him back. He took the walking stick, he threw it on the floor, it broke, and what happened? All the money came out of the walking stick, and found out that this guy had hollowed out the walking stick. He put the money in, and he pulled this shtick where he had technically paid the guy back by handing him the walking stick. So at the time that he took the Shevuah, he wasn't lying, but ultimately he had the shtick to keep the money. And Chazal said, you know what, we can't have people having these little shtick up their sleeve when they make a Shevuah. We're going to make them swear based on what we say, and no shtick allowed. Now the Gemara goes on to a discussion about Shevuos Madav Miktzas. A couple of things we have to keep in mind over here as we go into this Gemara. I just want to get ourselves a little familiar with the terminology, so like this will all go very smoothly and very easily. We have something called a taina. A taina is the claim, which basically that includes the entire claim. So if Reuven goes over to Shimon and claims that Shimon owes him money, whatever he specifies that Shimon owes him, that's called the taina. Then we have something called the kfira. The kfira is whatever's going to be denied. So Reuven goes to Shimon and says, you owe me $100. Shimon denies that he owes 100. He denies that he owes 50, and he has the hodah, the admission that he owes 50. So the taina is 100, the kfira is 50, and the hodah is 50. It's a very simple, straight-up case. That's a typical case of Madav Miktzas. Person claims 100. The person responds and says they owe you 50. So he admits that he owes 50, that's going to be the hodah, and there's a kfira, there's a denial on 50. That's one set of terms to get in order. The kfira, the taina, and the hodah. We're also going to have to remember the following, that when we talk about money in the Mishnah, there's two different ways of describing money. There's davka. Davka means that I am claiming that I specifically am owed the following type of money from you. So if I say you owe me 50 dimes, so I'm asking you for dimes specifically. If I say a certain amount of gold, I'm asking you for gold. If I ask you for copper, I'm asking you for copper. If I'm asking you for silver, I'm asking you for silver. That's dafka, where I'm essentially saying that it's not an amount of money, it's not a worth that I'm asking you for. So in other words, a person says to somebody, you owe me $100 bills. So technically, generally, you don't view that as dafka, that I want dollar bills. What you're saying is you want $100. So now if the person denies it in quarters, nickels, singles, $2 bills, $5 bills, $20 bills, it all makes no difference, because what we're talking about is shaveh. Shaveh means it's just the worth. It's the worth of what I'm claiming. So again, dafka means a specific denomination, specific type of coin. Shaveh means a value of a coin. And the last thing we have to remember is the concept of hoda mimina taina. That means that if I go to somebody and I claim that he owes me, I make my taina. My taina is the claim that you owe me a certain amount of money. Now, the person denies my claim, but he admits something else. Now, generally speaking, when a person denies part of the claim, but admits to part of the claim, that's the concept of a moda b'miktsas, where he's obligated to take a biblical oath. He has to take an oath on whatever he denies. However, there is a caveat. According to most opinions, like we're going to say, like we're going to see, we saw in the Mishnah already, the hodah has to be mina taina. So therefore, if a person claims that I owe him $100, and I say I owe you a hot dog, so then the hodah is not mina taina. There's two different stories here. One of them is a monetary claim that I owe you $100, and then the admission that I'm admitting that I owe you money is essentially saying that I owe you a hot dog or a pastrami sandwich, and it has nothing to do with what I claim. So let's just make sure we get all those terms in order, and then the Gemara will go very smoothly. Again, taina is what I claim, hodah is what I admit, kfira is what I deny, dafka means a very specific coin, shaveh means the value of those coins, hodah mimina taina means that I'm admitting to something similar to the claim, except there's a variation in the amount. Hodah, which is not mimina taina, in other words, it's a admission which is not from the same type as the claim. That is where I am admitting to something entirely different than what you claimed, and therefore it would technically, according to most opinions, not be subject to the entire concept of hodah b'miktsas. Amar Rav. Rav tells us the following. The Gemara starts off with the Mishnah, taina shtei kesef. The Mishnah tells us that a taina, the claim has to be 2 kesef. And we learned this from the pasuk. We're going to see this very soon again. The pasuk teaches us, when it comes to moda b'miktsas, it has to be that there's at least 2. There's 2 kesef, 2 coins. Again, well, generally speaking, anytime we speak about money, it always refers to a shava pruta. However, when it comes to a hodah b'miktsas, to this concept of moda b'miktsas, the claim needs to start off with 2 coins. It needs to start off with 2 coins. So there, look how Rav says this. Amar Rav, kefiras taina shtei kesef. The denial, the amount of money that you are denying that you owe, that has to be 2 kesef. What does that mean mathematically? That the claim had to have been 2 kesef plus a pruta. Why? Because if I'm going to deny that I own 2, if I deny that I owe 2, so then if the claim was 2, then I've denied the entire claim. So if I'm denying that I owe 2, the claim must have been 2 plus. So according to Rav, our Mishnah says that when it says 2 kesef, it means the denial must be 2 coins. But the claim must have been more than that. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, no, incorrect. Taina atzma shtei kesef. The claim is 2 coins. And therefore, filu lo kafar ela b'pruta, if he only denies 1 pruta, so the person says, you owe me 2, and he says, I owe you, or he denies only a small amount, which is a pruta, or the other way around. If lo hoda ela b'pruta, he only admits that he owes a pruta, chayiv. Simple difference between Rav and Shmuel is, according to Rav, the entire claim is going to have to be 2 pruta plus, and the denial must be at the value of 2 kesef. According to Shmuel, the entire claim could be 2 kesef, and the denial could be the most minimal amount, which is a pruta. The Gemara says, Amar Rava. Rabbi says there's something very interesting that happens here. If you learn our Mishnah, it seems like Rav is correct. However, if you learn the Psukim in the Torah, it seems like they are Kavasei de Shmuel. They seem to imply that Shmuel is correct. Now let's go through this. Our Mishnah seems to back up Rav's opinion. Dikatani, for it says, Hataina. In the Mishnah, the words were Hataina. The claim is Shtei Kasef, 2 coins. V'hoda, and what he admits on is shava pruta. Now, the ilu, Rashi takes it the word taina. Look at Rashi, says, hachi garsin vil kfiras pruta lo katanis. Therefore, the ilu, kfiras pruta lo katani. It doesn't say that there should be a kfira of a pruta. In other words, if the Mishnah said that the kfira is a pruta, then Shmuel would be correct. It doesn't say that. It says in the Mishnah, Hatayna shte kesef v'hahoda shava pruta. What he admits to is a shava pruta, which means Rav is probably correct that the admission has to be. The admission could be a pruta, but the kfira has to be 2, and what's left is going to be another pruta. Tananami, we learned in another Mishnah things with regard to shava pruta. Hahoda, when a person admits to something, it's going to be b'pruta. V'ilu kfira b'pruta l'katani. In that Mishnah, when it's listing things off that are sufficient with 1 pruta, it does not say that when a person denies the amount of money that they owe, that it's sufficient to deny a pruta. You know why it doesn't say that? Because Rav is correct that the denial must be a minimum of 2 coins. So therefore, when you learn the Mishnayos seem to indicate that Rav is correct, and in order to biblically obligate someone to take an oath of a modim miktzas, a person who admits to part of a loan, the denial must be on 2 coins, and that essentially means that the claim had to have been 2 coins plus a pruta. So he admits to a pruta, he denies 2 kesef. Now the cry, Kavasei de Shmuel, Psukim in the Torah seem to back up Shmuel. Why? It says in the pasuk, Kitein ish el re'eu kesef okelim. A person will give his friend either money or vessels. What does he give it to him for? Lishmar, to watch it. Now, ma kelim shnayim, just like kelim, just by definition, the word kelim is a plural. So ma kelim shnayim, av kesef shnayim. We compare, since it says in the pasuk, a person will give his friend kesef, money, or kelim. Now, technically, you want to be very technical about it, kesef, money, is to a certain extent a keli, not with regard to hilchas mukta, but again, a kesef is a metaltal, it's a movable object, just like any other keli. So why does it have to say you give your friend money or kelim? Why couldn't you just say one? So the Gemara understands that you compare each one to the next. Ma kelim shnayim, just like the word kelim is plural, and it indicates that there are 2. Af kesef shnayim. So it must mean that the money is going to be 2 as well. So we learn with this claim of hodaba miktas, you have to have at least 2. That's where we learn this from. Now, ma kesef davar chashuv, af kol davar chashuv. Just like kesef has to be a davar chashuv, any item that you're going to give has to be a davar chashuv as well. Now, v'ka'amar rachmana, when the Torah told us with regard to the halacha of hodaba miktas, ki hu zeh, the person admits that I don't owe you what you're claiming. Rather, ki hu zeh, the only thing I owe you is this. Now, hold on a second. What was it that the entire claim was? It was 2 kesef. So again, if you look at the pasuk strictly, you're saying just like kelim are 2, money is 2. That seems to indicate the entire loan or the entire amount of money in dispute over here is 2 coins. What does the person admit to? Ki hu zeh. I'm sorry, a part of that too. So it seems like Shmuel's correct. Even if the claim was only 2 kesef, and he admitted to only part of that, which is obviously less than 2 kesef, that would meet the criteria of modeh b'miktzas, and you'd have to take a shvuah, which is like Shmuel, not like Rav. Now Rav is going to respond to that, says the Gemara. Rav, you can't learn it from those words, says Rav. You can't learn it from that one, because this entire pasuk just teaches me the entire concept of Hodab Miktas Ataina. This is just telling you that if you deny the entire loan, then you're off the hook without a Shvuah Midaraisa. We're going to learn that you have to make a Shevuos Hasis, you have to take a rabbinic oath, but ultimately Midaraisa, there's not going to be any requirement to take a Shevuah. That's what Kiyuz that teaches us. Doesn't teach us that it could be less than 2 kesef. Shmuel is going to respond and say, Ksiv hu, it says ki hu, and it says zeh. So again, it's a little bit redundant. Only hu, or it could have said ki hu, or it could have said ki zeh. Why does it say ki hu zeh, hu and zeh? So from there, Shmuel learns those 2 things. The kafar b'miktas, number 1, if he's going to deny part of that too, v'odi b'miktas is going to admit to part of those 2, chayiv. So again, Rav is now going to have to defend himself, because according to Shmuel, the kihu and zeh teach us the concept of hodah b'miktas, and that it could be any part of those 2 coins, not like Rav, who says that it has to be 2 coins in the denial plus another part which he's going to admit to. Rav, one of those words, either hu or zeh, is to teach us the concept of hodah b'miktas ataina, that when a person denies part of the loan but admits to part of the loan, he has to take a shvuah. The other one teaches me the concept that the hodah needs to be mimin ataina, like we mentioned earlier. Whatever you admit to has to actually be part of the same loan, the same discussion. It can't just be a random other item. Shmuel says, whatever you want to learn from here, the bottom line is, you could learn it from the words of hu or zeh, or not. At the end of the day, if the entire claim was 2, and I'm only admitting to part of that, whatever you want to learn. You want to learn hodah b'minataina, no problem, you can learn that. You want to learn the concept of hodah b'miktas, you can learn that. But when you put the whole thing together, if the claim was 2, and he denied part of it, and he admitted to part of it, you're going to be stuck saying that he denied less than 2. That's how Shmuel understands the psukim to mean that the entire claim could be 2 and the denial could be less than 2. That's the Gemara reads. Don't you learn from there? He's missing part of the taina, because whatever it is he's going to admit to, he's missing. So El Amalach Rav can respond. Kesef ki asa meikar l'kfir hudasa. You misunderstood what the pasuk meant. You thought when the pasuk was telling you, it said kesef. It was talking about kesef o Caleb. You thought it was telling you that the claim was 2 kesef. No, incorrect. The pasuk says kesef. It was talking about the denial. The denial was 2 kesef. The claim obviously must have been more than 2 kesef. So the denial is 2 kesef. It says Rav, these psukim are not a problem for me. I'm perfectly fine with them, and they back up my opinion as well, which is that the denial is two coins, and that must have meant that the claim was more than that. Why? And he says, I'll prove it to you. Dimkain, because if the word kesef was not talking about the denial, rather was talking about the claim, Lichter Brachmana, Kiyitin Ish Aryeh, Kalim Lishmar. Why can't you simply say a person will give his friend Kalim Lishmar Amina, and now no, Ma Kalim Shnayim, just like Kalim is going to be 2, Kol Shnayim, everything has to be 2. So kesef the kasv Rachman Alamali. Why bother writing the word kesef? Leave it out. I'll figure it out. So Emeno Inni L'Taina, if it's not going to be relevant to the actual claim, because it's totally irrelevant, doesn't even need to be mentioned. Teneu Inni L'Kfira, you could apply it to the denial. So this is like a concept of sometimes the Torah writes something which is not necessary. You understand it's written for something, and it could be pulled out and it could be pasted somewhere else. So the word kesef was not necessary to be mentioned with regard to the taina. So therefore, we're going to, which the taina again means the claim, we're going to apply it to the denial, and the denial is going to have to be 2 kesef according to Rav, and he's not bothered by the way the psukim are written. As a matter of fact, he feels like the psukim are very consistent with what he said. Shmuel is going to say to you, if the pasuk would only write that a person gives his friend kalim, v'lo kasav kesef, it does not say money there. Havi amina, I would have thought ma kalim shnayim af kol shnayim. I would have thought everything has to be 2. Vol davar chashiv lo be'ina. It doesn't have to be davar chashiv. So therefore, kamash malan. That's why we wrote kesef over there to tell you that it has to be something of value as well. And that's why it was important to write kitin ishra'eu kesef okelim, and that's relevant to the actual claim. It's not extra. It's not superfluous. It can't be taken out and plugged in somewhere else, and therefore it must mean that the entire claim was 2 according to Shmuel. And therefore, the denial can be less than 2. According to Rav, the denial must be a minimum of 2, and therefore the claim has to be more than 2. So now we're going to try to prove who is correct about this machlokas. So again, to simplify the machlokas, according to Rav, the denial must be 2, and consequently what that means is the claim has to be 2 plus. According to Shmuel, the entire claim can be 2, and the denial can be even a pruta. Tanan, learn in our Mishnah. Shtei kesef yesh li biyadecha. Thank you. Shtei kesef yesh li biyadecha. I have 2 coins in your hand. So notice this very carefully. What does he say? Shtei kesef. I have 2 silver coins. Yesh li biyadecha. I have in your hands. The person responds and he says, Ein lecha biyadi ela pruta. The only thing that I have in my hands, which is yours, in other words, the only thing I owe you is a pruta. Potter. He is not obligated to make a Shevuos. Why is that? My taima, what's the reason for that? Lav mishum dechasra la taina. Isn't it because it's not sufficient? So now, in other words, according to Rav, the claim always has to be more than 2, because you have to have a denial of 2. So now, what would be the reason why, in this case, he's not obligated to make a Shevuos? Probably because Rav is correct, that you have to have a minimum of 2 in denial, which means the claim has to be more than that. But you have to do Shmuel. Amalach Shmuel, says, so Shmuel will say no. Mi savrit shava katani. You think that the Mishnah is talking about the value of 2 coins? No. That's not what it's talking about. Dafka katani. He meant to say, you owe me these 2 silver coins. Says Shmuel, you misunderstood the entire Mishnah. You thought that the problem over here was that the value was 2, and he had the value of the entire claim was 2, and therefore the claim wasn't the denial wasn't sufficient, like Rav. No, that's not true. The reason why he doesn't have to make a Shevuos over here is because there's 2 different things. There's copper and silver. The person claims copper and he admits to silver. That's not it's not like admitting to part of the loan. He is 100% denying what the person claims of him. And he's saying, I owe you 0 silver. I don't owe you anything. Therefore, it does not meet the criteria of Hadam and Minatayna. Gemara says, if that's the case, Yihachi Shmuel, that the reason why he's pater from a Shevuos is because it's not a Hodam Minatayna, Ema Seif. Let's go further on in the Mishnah. It says, Shtei kesef upruta yesh li biyadecha. Basically, you owe me 2 silver coins and a copper coin. And the person responds and he says, Ein lecha biyadi ela pruti. The only thing that I have of yours in my hand is 1 copper coin. Chayiv. He's chayiv. Now, let's analyze this. If you understand that he's just claiming the value of a certain amount of money, which ultimately you'll take out a calculator and figure out how much 2 silver coins plus a copper one is worth, I understand why he's chayiv, because this is exactly what Rav said. You have a claim of a certain amount of money and a denial of sufficient amount of money, and therefore he's going to be chayiv. If you're going to tell me that he's specifically asking for silver coins and copper coins, am I chayiv? Masha to'anu, what he claimed, lo hodolo, he didn't admit to. Masha hodolo, lo to'anu. He didn't admit to anything was part of it. In other words, again, if you're telling me that it's not a value of a certain amount of money, rather it's specific coins that the person's claiming, so He admitted that he owes him certain coins, and he denied that he owes him other coins. It's not like it's one big claim. It's several different claims. He agrees that he owes him a piece of copper. He doesn't agree that he owes him any silver. And this is not a case of Hodah b'miktzas. This is considered to be Hodah Shlom min Ataina. So Gemara says, Miduhu time el Shmuel. In other words, remember, you're talking to Shmuel over here, says the Gemara. Now, according to Shmuel, you have to recognize that Shmuel is not going to be stuck with that. He's not going to have a problem with that. Why? Because even though Shmuel is of the opinion that the Hodah, that the admission needs to be b'min Ataina, similar to the claim, Amar of Nachman Amar Shmuel, a person goes to someone and says, you owe me wheat and barley, and he admits to one of them, chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. In other words, that makes sense. In other words, you have to understand that even though there's a concept called the Hodah has to be b'min Ataina, there are various levels of what that means. In other words, the most strict way of viewing it is that if there are several different items in the claim, then a partial claim has to admit to part of all those items. So, for example, if a person's claiming silver, gold, and copper, and the person admits to copper, so then that has nothing to do with the silver and the gold. That's the most strict way of viewing it, which is how Rav views it. Shmuel doesn't view it that way. Shmuel says it's true that you have to claim, you have to make a claim, it's Shmuel, start over again. Shmuel admits that it's true that you have to deny something which is similar to the claim, but if you have a wide claim, which includes several different coins, and you're going to admit to part of it, that's considered a Hodah b'min Ataina. It's very different than a person saying, you owe me $100, and the person saying, I owe you a hot dog or a pastrami sandwich, because then the pastrami sandwich has nothing to do with the claim. But if I claim that you owe me barley, wheat, spelt, and rye, and I say I owe you rye, but not barley, wheat, and spelt, so according to Shmuel, that's considered to be a Hodah b'min Ataina, and that's why this is not going to be a problem according to Shmuel. This seems to make sense, but the Tani Sefer, since it says at the end of the Mishnah, Litra zav yesh li biyadecha. In other words, you owe me a certain amount of gold. The guy responds, says, I only owe you the same exact amount, but not in gold, rather in silver. Potter. Now, if you're going to tell me that, like Shmuel was telling us, that our Mishnah is saying davka, not that he's asking for a certain amount of value of money, rather he's talking about specific coins. Shemachi Potter. I understand why he's Potter, because what he claimed was not what he denied was not what was claimed. Eliyam Shlama Shava. If you're going to tell me like Rav that our Mishnah is talking about just a value of a certain amount of money, am I Potter? Why would he be Potter? Litra tuva havi. Litra is Allah, and therefore his denial is going to be sufficient. Elmi de Seifa Dafka. Since at the end of the Mishnah it's talking about Dafka, Reishanami Dafka. The Reish is also talking about dafka, specific type of coins, and therefore the Gemara says, Lema davi tiyufta to Rav. Let's just say our Mishnah is going to be a tiyufta to Rav. If you look at Rashi explains this. It's the second plus Rashi on the page. Lema davi tiyufta me Reish. In other words, the Katani, what does it say? It says, Shtei kasef yesh li biyadecha. You owe me 2 coins. And the guy responds and says, Ein lecha biyadi ela pruta. I only owe you a pruta. He's Potter. Now, V'taima, the reason is V'shum davka tanan, because it's asking for specific types of coins. Masha tanu lo hodalo. The reason why he doesn't have to make a shvuah is why? Because what he's admitting to is not what was claimed. Now, what's the inference of that? The inference is hatanu shava. V'hodalo shava, if you would have claimed a certain amount and he admitted to a certain amount, chayiv, he would be chayiv. But what's the problem? In our Mishnah, the whole claim was 2 coins. In other words, the reason why actually he's going to be Potter in our Mishnah from a Shevuos is because there's a problem. It's not a Hodah b'min Ataina. What was he talking about? He asked him for silver. He admitted to copper. So that means you didn't admit to what was claimed. That's why you're going to be Potter. Now, if that was not the case, if the Mishnah was talking about a certain value of coins, in such a case, it seems like you would be chayiv. Now, hold on a second. The entire claim was 2 coins. We said several times this morning that according to Rav, the claim has to be 2 plus, because the denial has to be 2 coins. It seems like our Mishnah is a tiyufta on Rav, Amalach Rav will say no. Kula masnisin shava. The entire Mishnah is talking about the value of the coins, not the very specific types of coins. The litra, zav, shani. When it comes to a litra of zav, that's going to be very different. Why is it different? Look at bottom Rashi. Litra shani, the kivan the tanu mishkal vaday dafka katani. Since he mentioned a certain weight, litra is a weight, in that case he meant to say dafka. Avokol matpeos masnisin shava katani. When we're talking about coins, that's talking about the value of the coins. When you speak about the weight of the coins, that's going to be different. Shederach matpea lasoso damim l'chol dvarim. So therefore, you don't actually have a problem with Rav, even though at the end of the Mishnah when it says litra, it's talking about specific types of coins. Every other place when it says coins in the Mishnah, Rav could very easily just explain to you that it's talking about a certain value. Teda will prove this. The Katanim Seif at the end of the Mishnah. By the way, Daf Mem and Aleph. We're starting today's Daf right now. Teda the Katanim. It says, oh man, 6:30 already. The Katani Seifa, it says at the end of the Mishnah, dinar zav libya decha, you owe me a dinar zav, ein lecha biyadi ela dinar kasha. The person responds and says, I owe you a silver dinar, and where he says, v'trisis upundian upruta chayiv. In those cases, he is chayiv. Now, shakol min matbeya echad hein achasin. All those are considered one type of coin. Now, yeah, Rabbi Shlomo, if you're going to say Shava, you're talking about the value. I can understand Mishamachi Chayiv, that's why I'm Chayiv, because we're talking about a value. All these coins are considered part of the value. If you're going to tell me he's asking for specific coins, am I Chayiv? Why is he Chayiv? I'm Rabbi Lazar b'shatadu dinar matbeyas. Lazar explains, in that case, he's talking about he asked for a dinar matbeyas. In other words, he asked for a very specific type of coin which had a very specific type of stamp on it. Kamash Malan, what's the Mishnah teaching us? The pruta b'chla matbea isa. Pruta is considered to be part of the coins. The kanami, it seems like that's going to be that is the case. Why the katani? For it says shakol min matbea achas. All of them are one type of coin. Now Rav's going to respond and say, we're not talking about dafka, we're talking about shava. Rav says shakol din matbeachas. It's all referring to a very specific din, to the laws of the matbea. Now, Rabbi Lazar lema midaseifa kishmuel. Since Rabbi Lazar seems to be saying the end of the Mishnah follows Shmuel. In other words, lema midaseifa kishmuel mataris. Since he's explaining the last line of the Mishnah like Shmuel, reish nami kishmuel, must be he holds like Shmuel as well. In other words, why can we infer from here that Rabbi Lazar holds like Shmuel? That it's sufficient if the entire claim is only 2 coins and the denial is only a pruta. Where it says no. Seifa dafka katani. The seifa is talking about dafka, specific types of coins. Why? Shakol min matbei achas v'reisha karav o Shmuel. Reisha could be either like Rav or Shmuel. In other words, it's not dependent one on the next. Tashema. Now the Gemara is going to try to bring a raya. Dinar zav zahov libiyadecha. Person goes to someone else and says, I have a dinar zav. Again, this Tashema is trying to prove whether it's dafka or it's shava. When a person makes a claim, is he asking for specific coins or is he asking for a value? The person goes to someone else and says, you have a dinar type of coin, which is zahav zahov libiyadecha. It's a minted type of gold coin in your hand. Ein lecha biyad dinar kesef. The guy responds and says, yes, I have something of yours, but it's a dinar kesef. Chayiv, he's chayiv. What now? Taima, what's the reason? Taima the amar le zahav zahov. It's only because he said that I have this minted coin. Hastama, if you would not have said that, shava ka'amar, it must be that he would have meant the value. In other words, the only reason why it's considered to be a dafka, specific type of coin, is because you said it. So the Gemara says, no, amalach Rav Ashi, hachi kamar, kol aimer dinar zav, kamar dinar zahav zahov dami. In other words, we don't have a raya from here. The fact that it says zahav zahov doesn't mean he actually articulated the words zahav zahov. We're just teaching them when a person says, you have a golden coin of mine in your hand, what he meant to say was a stamped coin, which means dafka. We don't have a raya that had he not said it, would have mean just the value. Tani Rav Chia l'sayu l'Rav. Rav Chia is going to bring a raya to Rav. How is that? Sell li biyodecha. A person says, I have a coin in your hands. Person responds and says, "Ein lecha biyadi ela sela chaser beis kasef." You only have a seller which is missing beis kasef. In other words, minus 2 coins. Chayiv. Chaser ma minus a ma, he's potter. This is 100% like Rav. In other words, here it seems like it's a little bit interesting language, but let's just say it in English. If a person says to someone, "You owe me a sela," and he responds by denying 2 coins, he's chayav to make a shvuah. Who is that? That's Rav. Rav says you have to deny 2 coins. If he says chaser ma'ah, he says, no, I'm denying a ma'ah, which is less than 2 coins, he's going to be potter. That's 100% like Rav, which is that the denial has to be at least 2 coins. And the Gemara goes on. Amar Nachman bar Yitzchak. Amar Shmuel. Lo shanu. The only time we learned that there's a requirement of the denial being a specific amount of money, where Rav says it has to be 2 coins, that's only betainas malva v'odas lova. That's when the lender claims something and the borrower denies it. Avoltainas malva. What happens if the lender makes a claim, v'ha'adas eid echad, and one witness comes by and says that he owes part of the money, afil lo tanu ela pruta, even if the entire claim is 1 small pruta, chayiv, he's going to have to make a shvuah. In other words, an eid echad, a single aid, has the ability to impose a shvuah. My taima. What's the reason for that? The ksiv, it says, lo yakum eid echad be'ish. The pasuk teaches us that an eid echad does not have the ability to extract money from someone else. L'chol avon l'chol chatas, for any sin, for any chatas, l'chol avon l'chol chatas hu deinu kam, avol kamu l'shvuah. An eid echad has the ability to require someone to take a shvuah. In Netanya, we learned kol makom sheshnayim mechayven also. Any time 2 eidim are mechayven also mamon will require a person to pay money. Eid echad mechayv shvuah. An eid echad could require shvuah. In other words, eid echad is exactly similar to 2 eidim, except in the result. 2 eidim can extract money, even if they claim a person owes somebody only a pruta. Same thing is true. 2 eidim could be mechayiv, someone could obligate someone to pay money, even if it's only a pruta. Therefore, an eid echad, a singular aid, could obligate someone to make a shvuah, even if it's only on a pruta. A person claims that someone owes him wheat and barley. He agrees to one of them. So let's just say he agrees he owes him barley, but not chit. What's the halacha? Chayiv. He is chayiv. In other words, let's just clear this up. A person claims, you owe me chitim, you owe me wheat, and the person says, no, I owe you barley. Everyone agrees that's not moed mixas because it's not a odab minataina. That's like saying, I'm claiming one item, I deny that item entirely. So let's go with the chitim and sorum case. Reuven goes to Shimon and says, you owe me chitim, you owe me wheat. Shimon responds and says, no, I owe you barley. That's not moed mixas. That's a 100% denial and a voluntary admission. However, if he comes over to the person and says, you owe me wheat and barley, the person admits to the barley, that's considered to be a hadab minataina, and he is chayiv. Amalor Yitzchak said to him, Yi yasher. Yes, this is true. In other words, yashakayach. You're correct. And he responded and said, Mechina Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says the same thing. Now, from the fact that he said that Rabbi Yochanan agrees to this Mechlal de Palag Reish Lakish, it seems like Reish Lakish will argue with this. Some will say, no, that's not true. We have no raya that Reish Lakish argues with this, and Reish Lakish would be of the opinion that if a person claims wheat and barley and he admits to one of them, let's say the barley or the wheat, he's going to be obligated to take it. And that Rabbi Yochanan will say he has to take a shvuah. Reish Lakish will say no, he does not have to take a shvuah because it's not minataina. Ikeda Amri, the reason why Reish Lakish did not comment was because Misha hu shahile. Reish Lakish, if you look at Rashi says Reish Lakish had this practice that he was a very good listener. He didn't interrupt people. He would let the person finish talking completely. If you look at Rashi, it's the first wide line in Rashi. At the bottom, Rabbi Yochanan says something in the base medrash. Hayashoa milahashiv ad yigmar Rabbi Yochanan kol tzarcha v'chol tam dvarav. He'd only speak up afterwards. Now, what happened was B'Sokach Yatzer Rabbi Yitzchak Zeb Beis Medrash V'Loshamar Nechak Kalav. In other words, he had no idea if Reish Lakish argued because he left the Beis Medrash too early. Others say it's not that he was waiting the whole time to speak. He was drinking some water while Rabbi Yochanan was talking. V'shasek, and he was being quiet because he wasn't talking while he was drinking. Therefore, we don't have any indication of what Rish Lakish's opinion was. Let's try to bring a right to this point. Person claims you owe me wheat, and he admits he owes him barley. Potter. Why? You see, Potter, we know, because it's not a dam in a taina. Rabbi Gamliel disagrees. He says, even if the Hadah is not similar to the claim, he's going to be chayiv. Time of the Tanu Chitim, the reason is because he claimed Chitim v'Hadol B'Sar, and he only admitted with barley. What would happen if he claims both Chitim and Sar v'Hadol B'Achim, and you agreed with one of them? Chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. Gemara says, no, that's not true. We don't have a raya from there. Who didn't feel chitim sar nami pater? The same is true even if he claimed both wheat and barley. Why is it we said chitim? We wanted to point out Gamliel. Gamliel says you do not have to have a hodam in a taina. So if we wanted to find the most extreme case of that, which is person claims wheat and he admits to barley, Gamliel is going to say he has to make a shvuah. That's why we mentioned that. But again, the same thing would be true even if he claimed wheat and barley. He only admitted to one of them. Tashma. Try to bring a right to this. Tanu kelim v'karkos. A person goes to someone and says, you owe me movable objects and real estate. So, I don't know, he says, you owe me that piece of property that he identifies a piece of property and the lawnmower that's on it. He admits that the lawnmower belongs to that person. He denies the karka, or the other way around. He agrees that the piece of property belongs to him. He denies the kalim. Potter, he's going to be potter. Why? Next case. What happens if he admits to part of the karka? Potter, he's going to be potter. Mixas kalim. If he agrees that he owes him part of those kalim, of those movable objects, he's going to be chayiv. Now, taima to kalim and karkos. What's the reason why he's going to be potter in all these cases? Because we're talking about movable objects and karka. And what's the problem with admitting to karka la bashvoyi? You can't swear about karka. Ha kalim kalim. What if it was two different movable objects? In other words, the whole problem in this case is that one of the items is real estate, and real estate is not subject to a shavua. What happens if it was kalim and kalim? It's two movable objects doing the kalim and karkos, which is similar to kalim and karka. Basically, it means two different objects. So he says, you owe me, for example, wheat and barley. Chayiv, he would be chayiv if he admits to one of them. And the Gemara says no. Who had dinner feel kalim and kalim nami pater? Same thing would be true even if it's two different movable objects. What's the reason why it says kalim and karkos? Kamash Blaz is teaching us the halacha. If he would admit to part of the kalim, chayiv would be chayiv af ala karkos. You'd have to make a shvuah even on the karka. Why? Kamash Blaz is teaching us. Teach me the halacha that you could roll one shvuah into the next. There's no reason to teach that. Tanina, we already learned that. In other words, what's the reason why it says karka in this case? Just teach me the halacha that when you're swearing on movable objects, you could stretch the shvuah to swear on the karka as well. Now, what's the point in teaching me that? We know that already. It's remission. The Gemara says no. This is actually the first place where we learn it. This is the main place we learn the halacha. You're right, above Mitzvah, we learned the halacha somewhere else. There, we're just parenthetically, we're talking about acquiring karka and movable objects, so we mentioned it there, but here's the actual real place where we teach it. And yes, you know why we said karka and movable objects? Because we wanted to teach you once you're swearing movable objects, you could swear on karka as well. Now the Gemara has exactly the opposite, entire inverse of the previous Gemara. Says the name of Yochanan. A person claims chitim, visarim, and barley. The hodlo he admits to one of them. Potter, exactly the opposite. We just got finished saying he's chayav. Here he says, Patim, no shvuah. Didn't Rabbi Yitzchak tell us before that he's correct? Rabbi Yochanan says this. In other words, it's a complete and total contradiction. Before you told me Rabbi Yochanan says he's going to be chayav. Here he's saying he's going to be pater. It is machlokes Amaroi and what Rabbi Yochanan said. Tashmal, try to bring raya. Exactly what we said before. Tonachitim, a person claims you owe me wheat, and he admits to the barley. Potter. Gamliel says he is chayiv. Now, time, but what's the reason why Tanachit v'Adol B'Sar? The reason is because he claimed wheat and he only admitted to barley. Hachitim usar. What if he would have done both? And he would admit to one of them. Chayiv. It sounds like he would be chayiv. The Gemara says no. Who didn't feel chitim v'sarim nami? The same thing could be true even if it's chitim and sa'arim. In such a case, it's still be potter. Why did it say like this? Why did it have these two? Why did we say only chitim or sa'arim? Want to make the point that Gamliel says he's going to be chayiv even if he only admits to one, because he says he does not have to be adam in a time. Tashmal trying to bring who's correct? Tana kalim karkos, exactly what we learned before. Person claims you owe me both movable objects and real estate. He admits to the kalim karkos. He denies the karka, or the other way around. The karkos, he admits that he owes him the real estate. He denies that the movable objects are his. Potter, why? Why? Because Because again, we're dealing with real estate. Now, what happens if it would be Hodl Mixes Karkas? What if you admit to part of the Karka? Still Potter. Why? Because again, it's real estate. However, the other way around, Mixes Kalim. What if he admits to part of the Kalim? Chayiv is going to be Chayiv. What time is the Kalim and Karkas? What's the reason? The reason why he's going to be Potter in this case is because he's talking about movable objects and real estate. The Karka Lavashvohi. Kalim Kalim doing the Kalim Karkas. What if it was two different movable objects and it's similar to Kalim Karkas? In other words, it's two different types of movable objects. What would the Allah be? He would be Chayiv. And Gemara says, no, that's not a Raya. What didn't the field Kalim now Potter? The same would be true even if it's wheat and barley. Well, Kamash one, this teaches us the Hodl Miklas Kalim Chayiv. If he's going to admit to partial Kalim, he's going to be Chayiv. Al Karkais. In other words, once he admits to part of the movable object, he has to make shvu even on the real estate. The Gemara says, what's the point of teaching me that? My Kamash one, so can you teach me the concept you could drag a shvu from movable objects onto Karka? Tanita, we learned that already. They could roll in the Chasm Sheish Makrayas. In other words, the real estate. Gemara says the same teretz. Ha-ikar. The Argamar is the main source of it. Hahi agav grora naspa. The other one was just mentioned parenthetically. Person claims you owe me an ox. He admits he owes me a sheep. He says, you owe me a sheep. He admits he owes me an ox. Potter. Tanu b'shar, if he claims a shar, v'seh, and an ox, he admits to one of them. Chayev. Who is that? That's from Gamliel. In other words, you have no raya from there. That's from Gamliel. Gamliel says it does not have to be minatayna. Gemara says, you Gamliel. If that's really the case, I feel reshanami. Even if he claims you owe me a sheep and he admits to an ox, that he should also be chayiv. Elaham ba'mani. Who is this Admon? He. It's Admon. Remember we had Admon in our Mishnah. It's Admon. Remember talking about the jugs, the thing, the wine in the jugs. He admitted to the jugs, not the wine. Below the Gemara says, don't think that I'm just trying to find some random teretz to answer your question. No. We have this is a solid source. It was constantly said that this case of the ox and the sheep is Admon. We will have to stop here for the day. Have a wonderful day. See everyone tomorrow. Mirza Hashem.